out. All right, guys. So thanks for sticking around to the last session of the conference. So it's another paper about Brazil, but this time we're going to talk about fiscal policy, a little bit different from the issues that we have been discussing here. So it's a macroeconomic effect of cash transfers evidence from Brazil with Wataru, Lan, Steven, and Leo. So the usual disclaimer applies here. So just an overview of the presentation. So we're just going to give a motivation for the program. Then I'm going to discuss some institutional details about the Bolsa Familia, the empirical setup, so the specification, identification strategy, the empirical results, and then we're going to talk about another small open economy new Keynesian model here, and then I'm going to conclude. So just a motivation for studying cash transfers. Cash transfers is an important tool of fiscal policy against poverty, but also has been used more recently as a counter-cyclical policy. So it's present in more than 130 countries and reached 1.5 billion recipients during COVID-19. So, given the size of these programs and how widespread they are, it's important to understand the impact of such transfers. So there's a very large literature on the micro effects of cash transfers on like education, health, stuff like that, but very little is known about the macro effects. So the main empirical question of this paper is the relative transfer multiplier. So what is the effect of a $1 increase of these types of transfers on local GDP and unemployment in the short run? Okay. And this is important because the theory doesn't have like a consensus about it. Some models will say that the multiplier is like low and even negative if it generates inflation, if the transfers are saved, spent on imports, or even if it reduces labor supply. Other models will say that the multiplier can be large if it's spent on local goods, prices are sticky, and if there's a slack in labor markets. So the multiplier is interesting by itself, but also helps us for selecting competing models. So in this paper, we'll estimate the macro effects of Bolsa Familia. So Bolsa Familia is the largest cash transfer in the world, covering more than 20 million families, which represents about 1/4 of the Brazilian population. So we'll estimate the multiplier of Bolsa Familia both on output and employment, using a more macro approach, using state-level data, and over like many years of the program. So it's not going to be specific to like one reform or one exogenous change in the program. You're going to use the whole variation across 15 years. So the identification will explore heterogeneous state exposure to national changes in Bolsa Familia. So it's a sort of like, it's a variation of a Bartik instrument. And we are the first to present evidence of the impact of Bolsa Familia on informal employment. So we're looking at both formal and informal employment here. So just a glimpse of the results. A state that receives an extra $100,000 reais of Bolsa Familia will generate extra 5 jobs, and output will increase by more than 200,000 reais. So this is a large multiplier of above 2. Also important is that the impact of this program lasts for many years. Finally, we will calibrate a small open economy new Keynesian model to Brazilian data, and we'll compute a multiplier from the Bolsa Familia in this model, and we will compare with the estimates in the data. So we will find that the new Keynesian model can only partially account for the large impact of Bolsa Familia that we find in the data. So just quickly through the literature, so our paper relates to Penny's 2021 AR, He uses also uses a Bartik instrument to estimate transfers multiplier in the United States. So he finds a multiplier of 1.5 in permanent social security transfers. In terms of Brazilian data, the focus has been on formal employment. Okay, so 2 papers find large impact. So Gerhard, Naidoo, and Silva, 2021, they study specific reform of Bolsa Familia, but they have a very different approach from us. They have like a different diff and looking for a specific reform. Corby and co-authors Restud also find a large impact, but they are looking at a different fiscal instrument. Toscani and co-authors this IMF paper studied the effects of the emergency aid during COVID in Brazil. They found very little impact of that on output, on formal employment. So just some details about the Bolsa Familia. It started in 2004 with 2 benefits. A basic benefit that any extremely poor family received 50 reais per month. At the time, this was about $50. And there's a variable benefit that both extremely poor and poor families receive 15 reais per month per child in the household. What's very important for us in our identification strategy is that the program is designed and paid for by the federal government. Okay, so the federal government will define the eligibility rules, benefit schemes, and very importantly, it will assign quotas to municipalities based on poverty maps. Okay. So the design of the program is done by the federal government, but the implementation is local. So basically, the municipalities, they will look at poverty data, and they will find the poor and enroll the poor in the program up to the quota that was established by the federal government. Okay. So as I said, we're going to exploit like many changes in the program from 2004 to 2019. Okay, so just I want to show you a little bit what types of changes there was in the Bolsa Familia during this period. So I'm plotting here the changes in the national transfers as a percent of GDP. So you can see that in the beginning, I'll try to decompose these transfers in 2 types of changes. So in the beginning, it's basically coverage because the federal government defined the initial quotas in 2004 and took like almost 4 years for the municipal localities to find the poor and enroll them in the program. After that, there was some revisions to the quota itself. So from time to time, the federal government gets new poverty data and it updates its quotas to match the new information about poverty in its municipality. Finally, after 2007, most of the variation in the program has really been coming from changes in average benefit per household. So this is like the federal government increasing the existing benefits or creating new benefits in the program. Okay. So just a hint of how we're going to identify variations in the Bolsa Familia, exogenous variations in the Bolsa Familia. So we're going to explore heterogeneous state exposure to the national changes in the Bolsa Familia. So the idea here is that poor states in the north are highly exposed to the national changes in the Bolsa Familia. So I'm plotting the same graph as I had before, but now I'm also plotting here the yellow line with the variation of Bolsa Familia in Piauí, which is a poor state in the northeast of Brazil. Okay, and you can see that the changes in Piauí are highly correlated with the national changes, but they are also like more volatile. So when the national Bolsa Familia increased by like 1% of GDP, Piauí state on average increased by 3% of GDP. So it's very exposed to what's happening at the national level. On the other hand, rich states in the south, they're much less exposed. So for example, if I plot here in blue, the variation in transfers for São Paulo, which is the most developed state in Brazil, and is in the south, you see that the program is pretty flat over time, so it's not really affected by what's going on at the national level. Then the empirical setup, we will use payload data on state output and transfers. So Y is output in state S and year T. So the left-hand side here is just output growth, state output growth. B is Bolsa Familia transfers, so the right side is changes in Bolsa Familia as a share of lagged state GDP. So this specification gives us a relative, not aggregate, output multiplier interpretation, okay? So the idea is this beta that we are estimating here is like the relative increase in output in a particular state S when it receives an extra real of Bolsa Familia relative to other states. So this is very different from the aggregate multiplier that you also see in the literature. We're going to add state and fixed effects, and also some controls. So the first identification challenge is reverse causality, right? If local economic shocks increase Bolsa Familia transfers, so the other way around. And the first thing you could think is that the Brazilian states, they run balanced budgets, okay? So if there is a local shock that decreases state revenues, then the state has to decrease spending, and this would generate some some bias in the estimates. But that's not the case for the Bolsa Familia because the Bolsa Familia is federally funded, okay? So there's no feedback from local budget to Bolsa Familia transfers. The second problem, and this is most serious, it's that the Bolsa Familia is a proper transfer, okay? So if there's an adverse shock in a particular state, and that leads to more poor people, then two things can happen. The first is that, because there are more people in your municipality, the local authorities might be faster in enrolling the new poor into the existing quotas. So this would increase transfers and generate a downward bias to the OLS estimate. But also, quotas may raise in the future when new poverty data comes in. So new poverty data comes in, the government updates the quotas, so you have some correlation between local shocks and transfers in the future. This also leads to bias. So to deal with that, we're going to estimate a two-stage least square using a Bartik-style instrument. So our IV explored, as I said before, different exposure of states to changes in the national Bolsa Familia. So the idea here is to decompose the Bolsa Familia, the state Bolsa Familia changes into a national component, this red component here, and an idiosyncratic state-level shock, the blue component. So reverse causality too, from local shocks to poverty and Bolsa Familia, sort of like, by definition here, they all affect the idiosyncratic shock. So if we instrument state Bolsa Familia with national changes, then we will eliminate this sort of like potentially endogenous state-level shocks. In this case, our identifying assumption is a much weaker one than the usual identifying assumption. So what it requires here is that the national Bolsa Familia does not respond to state-specific shocks. This is similar to Nakamura's Tyson 2014. And we argue here that this is very unlikely to happen particularly for the Bolsa Familia, because the Bolsa Familia is sort of like a complex national anti-poverty program, and it's not really like designed to serve as a countercyclical policy against like shocks in particular states. Specifically, changes in the Bolsa Familia are hard to make. They have to be discussed in Congress, passed by law. When they happen, they're almost permanent. So it's really hard to target year-to-year shocks in specific states. So in the first stage, we will basically estimate these state exposure shares. Okay, so we will regress changes in both state-level changes in Bolsa Familia on changes on the national Bolsa Familia interacting with state dummies. So we really have here like 27 IVs. Okay. the IV has to be relevant. Okay, so the first relevance restriction is that at least some of these gammas, they have to be different from zero. So there must be some feedback from national shocks to state shocks. So here I'm plotting the estimated gamma for each state in Brazil. So the black bars are states in the north, the blue in the northeast, and the rest in the south and the Midwest. So you can clearly see that for poor states in the north and the northeast, this gamma is very high. They are always significant at 5% level and much bigger than 1. Okay? So the second relevance restriction is that you need some heterogeneity in these gammas. Okay? So if all states are affected by the national Bolsa Família at the same proportion, then our IV doesn't have any cross-sectional variation. And this is easily, we can see that easily here, because states in the south, they sort of like, they have gammas that are like, mostly like not significant, or like closer or below 1. Okay, so there's a lot of heterogeneity across regions of how these states are affected. But just to note, so for example, in Maranhão, which is a poor state in the northeast, if the national Bolsa Família increases by 1%, the state Bolsa Família in Maranhão will increase by 6%. But if you look at São Paulo, which is a developed state in the south, it changes basically nothing, okay? So there's, just to notice here, this is not a thing about south and north, but there's also a lot of variation within region here, okay? The second challenge to identification is omitted variables. So something else affects both Familia and state output growth. Okay, so we will tackle this with, in 3 ways. The first is to add year-fixed effects to control for all aggregate shocks, so any change in monetary policy, taxes, commodity price, so on. State-fixed effects to control for state-specific trends in output and Bolsa Família growth. So if there is a omitted variable, it needs to vary both over time and across states. Okay? So this already like eliminates many of the candidates to be omitted variables here. Additionally, we're going to add some controls. The most important one is other federal transfers. They are correlated with Bolsa Família transfers, but we are also will control for poverty, state-specific exposure to commodity prices, and the national business cycle. Also, because we're exploiting like changes in like many states across 15 years of data, even if there is like a shock that was correlated in like a specific period to a specific state, it's probably not going to have like a big effect on the overall estimates. So just quickly, the data, it's from Bolsa Família, it's from the Ministry of Social Development. State output is real value added from the Brazilian system of national accounts. We do some data cleaning here that I'll skip. And then the empirical results. So first, looking at output. So the main result of this paper is our benchmark two-stage least square output multiplier of 2.2. It's large and significant at 5% level. As expected, it's bigger than the OLS, which is also large and significant. It has a very strong first stage, so there's a very strong relation between national and state level transfers. But also note that we have some sort of like large standard errors here, and that comes from some high volatility output at the state level. So if we split that between non-tradables and tradables, non-tradables here being services and construction, you see that the effect is coming from non-tradables. Okay? So non-tradables is high and significant, the tradable sectors are not. So this is consistent with a demand-driven yield energy model, where you receive transfers, you spend on local goods, and if prices are sticky, that stimulates your economy in the short run. So then we calculate the cumulative output multipliers. So we find that these multipliers are significant up to 5 years. They are large, not just on impact, but they remain large for a few years and they just slowly go down. And even at 5 years after the shock, you have a multiplier of 1.4, very significant at 5% level. Okay, so just comparing with the literature. So in our paper, we find a Bolsa Familia multiplier of 2.2. This is bigger than Penning's using US data for permanent social security transfers. This is sort of like slightly lower than Egger and co-authors, an econometric from last year that finds a multiplier of 2.5 from one-off transfers in Kenya. But that's similar from Corby and co-authors. Then they have like an implied multiplier, but using federal transfers to local governments in Brazil. So we're sort of like at the upper end of the estimates in the literature. Now going to the empirical results for formal employment. So formal employment, it's interesting in itself. It has been studied in other papers. But here's also like helps us to understand why we have such a large output multiplier. So we collect data on formal employment. So EMP is formal employment in state S and year T. So the left side is formal employment growth. The left side is Bolsa Familia, change in Bolsa Familia per formal worker, scaled by 100,000 reais. Okay. So the beta F has the relative job multiplier interpretation. So what is the increase in informal jobs when a state receives extra 100,000 reais of Bolsa Familia relative to other states? We use like high quality data from the Ministry of Labor for formal employment. And the main result in this section is that a state that receives this extra 100,000 of Bolsa Familia generates 3 new formal jobs relative to other states. Okay, it's large and significant at 1% level. However, because there's such a low labor productivity in Brazil, even if the impact on labor markets is big, it's only has like a moderate impact on output. Okay, so if you get like a simple rule of thumb that is used in the literature to transform job multipliers into output multipliers, we will recover a multiplier of 1. Okay, so it cannot really by itself explain the measured output multiplier of 2.2. So to compare the literature, we have to invert and convert to dollars because the literature typically talks about cost per formal job, just the invert. So in our paper, a job costs $10,000. Corby and co-authors cost $8,000. So the Gerhard and co-authors, it's much lower. And they also studying the Bolsa Familia, but a particular reform in 2009. But then the paper, the IMF paper, finds very small impact of Bolsa Familia and a very large cost per formal job. But that's during COVID, which is a different setup. So now informal employment multipliers. So we use data from the National Household Survey, looking at informal employees and informal self-employed. So informal jobs have very low productivity in Brazil. So if you look at the data, you see that one formal job is equivalent to 2 informal jobs. So we come up with this formal wage equivalent measure of employment, which basically sums across the 2 types of employment, but discounts informal by a half. Okay, and then we multiply, and then we estimate the formal wage job multiplier using a similar specification as the formal formal employment. So we find that an extra 100,000 reais of Bolsa Familia generates 5 formal wage equivalent jobs. That's significant at a 5% level, and it's almost twice as large as the formal employment multiplier. So a takeaway from these results here is that informality is key. Okay, so if you use this rule of thumb to transform the formal wage equivalent multiplier into an output multiplier, you recover a multiplier of 1.8, which is like much closer to the estimate 2.2 in the data. Then we have these results, and we go to a new Keynesian model, another new Keynesian model. Here I'm just going to describe the basics. So it's a standard open economy new Keynesian model. So this model was shown to be able to explain the transfer multiplier across US states from pennies 2021. So we calibrate that model to Brazil. So a small open economy in a monetary union that represents a Brazilian state. So households have preference between local goods produced within the state versus foreign goods produced outside the state in the country. Half of the population is hand-to-mouth, so they cannot borrow or lend. They don't have access to financial instruments. And poor residents will receive permanent Bolsa Familia transfers from the federal government, so sourced outside. Prices and wages are sticky. And then here I'm just going to compare, I'm just going to plot in the same graph that I had before the estimates for the empirical output multiplier. Now the red line shows the multipliers that comes from the new Keynesian model. So you can see that the multipliers, the new Keynesian model multipliers are much lower than the estimated ones, sort of like about half. You could argue that they are within the confidence intervals here, but our confidence intervals are very large as well. So the takeaway here is that new Keynesian multipliers cannot, fully explain what's going on in the data. So just to conclude, cash transfers are a very important tool of monetary policy, and it's becoming more important. But very little is known. There's a lot of literature on the macro level, but not a lot is known about the macro effects. So we identify macroeconomic effects of Bolsa Familia, exploring heterogeneous state exposure to national changes in the Bolsa Familia. So we are the first to measure the impact of this program on output. We find large and persistent output multipliers. So we are the first to measure the full impact of Bolsa Familia on output, including formal and informal employment. So informal employment in Brazil is almost half of the total labor force in Brazil. And we find that informality is key to rationalizing the output multiplier. We calibrate the model, a standard new Keynesian model to Brazil, and we find that the model can only partially account for the large effects of Bolsa Familia. And then this is like an open question. It's perhaps the model is lacking many features. Probably it's lacking in the formal sector, but maybe also because it abstracts from, supply side effect. The Bolsa Familia, it's like a program that, improves like the quality of life for many people in Brazil. So this might have some supply side effects, such through human capital, productivity, and so on. But it's not in the new Keynesian model.
I'm not a PC person. How does this work? What's the equivalent of Finder? Discussion slides. Nicola, did you upload the? Where? Yeah. No. I don't remember what my file name was. That's just. Could we just check? Sorry about this. No, I need my props. That's not so implausible. Okay, so yeah, I actually do kind of need to point at equations and stuff. So. I have my laptop here if that's easier. Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, right up at the top. Okay, we're in business. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the delay. Okay, I didn't memorize my discussion. Okay, so as we heard, so look, at least the version of the paper that I saw, everything is a variation on some two-stage least squares regression. You got some outcome WST. You've got this variable BST. Now what is that? That's Bolsa Familiar transfers paid to recipients in state S relative to that particular state's GDP in a particular year T. That's the variable of interest, or our coefficient of interest is beta naught. In some specifications, we're going to have some covariates, but notably the baseline results for everything doesn't have any covariates, just state and year fixed effects. Okay, so we worry about, as Arthur discussed nicely, there's a bunch of reasons to worry about, some reverse causality and stuff, or omitted variables, correlations, things that would create correlations between BST and epsilon ST. So what you do is you instrument, and you basically are trying to extract the component of this relative amount, this sort of relative importance of these transfers to a particular state. You're looking for the part of that that's predictable from national level trends. So B bar, here, think B bar T is like aggregate stuff, total Bolsa Familiar outlays relative to Brazil's GDP in a particular year. And then every state, and as we discussed, so some states, particularly in the north, are poor, and some states in the south are rich. And so when the aggregate program scales up or down, then these states are affected differently by that. And that creates some variation that hopefully is not related to local economic conditions in a destructive way. Okay, so and Arthur discussed very nicely, the instrument relevance is just what we said. There's a little, as a small distraction, this is sort of an unconventional way to construct so-called Bartik instruments. So typically, in papers that use this style of instrument, you have a bunch of known. So think of like the Otto Dorn and Hansen, very famous paper, or others in this literature. Paper where you've got a bunch of different cities or regions or something like that. You've got Charlotte, North Carolina, or South Carolina, and Miami, and whatever, and they have different industry shares. Some places have a lot of manufacturing, some places have a lot of whatever, service, retail, or something like that. And there's some national level trends. So you multiply the industry shares in a particular place by the national trends. And those, so notably, the industry shares are known and the national level trends are known, and that's how you construct what I usually think of as a Bartik instrument. Here, this is a bit different. Here, the gamma S, which is like the sensitivity of a particular state to the national trends, has to itself be estimated. So it's not exactly what we would call a Bartik instrument. It's kind of more like including a national level trend, the B bar T, and then including state-specific interactions with that trend. Maybe that doesn't matter, but at least you could maybe talk a little bit about the econometric consequences of that. Maybe it alters the precision of your estimates or something like that. So why else all right, so that's the part that's predictable from the national stuff. So why else does this fraction, the amount of transfers relative to local GDP vary? Well, there can be local changes in the income distribution or maybe bureaucratic take-up costs that could affect the numerator. There could also be variations in the size of the local economy that alter the denominator. Maybe there's some local business cycles, maybe there's measurement error, and I'll come back to that in a second. So that's instrument relevance. Instrument validity, well, what we hope and pray is that stuff that affects the idiosyncratic variation, that creates idiosyncratic variation in this BST, like changes in the local income distribution or maybe measurement error, we really hope that those things are not correlated with epsilon ST, which are things that cause state year specific fluctuations in whatever is the outcome. In some cases it's localized GDP growth, in some cases it's like total employment, or informal employment, or formal employment, whatever. Okay, so that's what we have to keep in mind. Now, what do? We run this regression for a bunch of different outcomes. So local GDP growth, you get a beta hat of 2.2, and they show by looking at different sectors, this is mostly non-tradables, or it seems to mostly be about non-tradables. If you do it for GDP per capita, you get a beta hat of 2.76. For different types of employment, they do this thing, as Arthur explained nicely, they scale these coefficients to give the interpretation, they sort of have the units of jobs per 100,000 real. You get beta hats of 3, 8.7 for informal jobs, much bigger, and if you aggregate them all together, you get a coefficient of 5.4. Okay, so my biggest issue here is who cares about these numbers? Are they relevant for some policy decisions? Like, which policymaker would care about beta equals 2.2 versus beta equals 1.7 or something like that? Maybe there are some well-defined policy problems for which this is like a very direct input, but I would like that case to be made explicitly. Do they confirm or revise some of our views of the mechanisms of fiscal policy? So I don't know. So I have to admit, full disclosure, I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm just sort of like an applied micro guy. So maybe this is background knowledge that I lack, but I'm not aware of it. There's this paper by one of Arthur's co-authors that motivates a similar sort of exercise in the US, looking at Social Security versus temporary transfers in response to like the global financial crisis. And the motivation there is stuff about, smoothing local, regional business cycles and how effective can you be at that. Can that case be made here with this type of policy? Because this is not, I don't know, maybe you can, but if that case can be made, I would like to see it made a lot more sharply. I think, just at a high level, I think it's helpful to ask what is a relevant null hypothesis here? is beta naught equals 1 an interesting number? Is beta naught equals 0 an interesting number? Now, there was a mention of this sort of in the first slide, which wasn't in the version of the paper I read, that maybe there are some theories that make us think, about, does this have to do with, to what extent is this stuff altering local prices or whatever? Maybe that means that beta equals naught is a relevant null. All of that is obviously, I don't claim to know this, but I think that we should be much more explicit about, this is the set of things we're ruling out, and this is the set of things that we're moving our priors in favor of. A big thing, or again, macroeconomists can tell me whether this is like totally misconceived, but there's nothing about taxation in the paper. So here we have a bunch of different multipliers, but there's no thought about, there's nothing mentioned about how are we paying for these things. So, and this is obviously speculative, but they were careful to mention, everything is relative to other states. So a state that receives relatively larger share of transfers experiences relative to other states more growth. Is that because there's an expansion in the receiving state or a contraction in a relative contraction in the other ones that are financing all the transfers? I don't know. Maybe that's I don't know. If that's implausible, I would like to see the citation. So yeah, what I didn't like about this is that it kind of feels like it's a technique in search of a question. We got a bunch of stuff, we put it on the left-hand side, and here you go, right? At least ex post. Now, obviously, we all know that's not really how research is done. That is, you create this, and then ex post, you have some story. Okay, but we need a coherent framework which ties these results together. There's some allusions to like a New Keynesian model that are made, but at least in the version of the paper I got, the model is not presented or solved in full. And fundamentally, why bring up monetary issues? Even in a barter economy, redistribution of endowments is going to change the equilibrium. So, and especially weird is that regional price differences is not an outcome that we put on the left-hand side, right? Now, over lunch, Arthur and I had this discussion that, regional CPI is not always available. I don't think, apparently that's not the case in Brazil. But there have got to be other ways of getting at local price differences, even for maybe for a narrower set of commodities, maybe just for housing, maybe just for wages, right? So, like, I don't know, look, to me, this is like, okay, so output expands, but what do I believe about prices? Is it that, like, is Brazil a place where all supply curves are horizontal? I don't know. I think the authors could make a lot more of the stuff about informal versus formal sectors, because a lot of this paper, at least as I saw it, it's almost incidental that it's about Brazil, right? There's sort of nothing about that's specific to a developing country. Like, what's different about developing countries and rich countries? I don't know. We have a bunch of theories. There's low productivity, maybe there are credit market imperfections, weak property rights, whatever. But kind of these things don't appear even rhetorically in the paper, and I think it would be stronger if we could make more of that. And I think the informal versus formal sector, which I give them credit for that. They do have some interesting stuff to say there about, like, look, it seems like it's very different for the formal and informal labor market. So I think that aspect of the paper could be expanded a bit more. Now I have some stuff to say about. I do appreciate the fact that they did a bunch of robustness checks. So they add a bunch of covariates to take care of some concerns. So, for example, they worry about, maybe this is spurious in the sense that there are these other non-Bolsa Familia federal transfers to states that might be correlated with it. So they add those as controls. That's nice. They add lagged state GDP growth and the concern about, like, maybe there's some mean reverting measurement error. And they include some state-specific interactions with major export prices. Whatever you do, beta hat stays in the range 2 to 3, at least for output stuff. So that's good. That's obviously nice to see. They do a placebo test where they use state GDP but lag 20 years, right? So before they look at output stuff on the things on the left-hand side that predate the existence of Bolsa Familia, and they show indeed there's no effect. So that's cool, but it seems like a very extreme straw man, right? Like why not, like why 20 years? Why not look at stuff that's lagged maybe 1 or 2 years? That seems like a less of an extreme departure from the main regressions of interest. Okay, so now I have something that's like maybe a little maybe helpful, maybe not so constructive to talk about, which is measurement error. So a vague possibility is omitted variables bias. So we all know that GDP is sort of a complicated thing to construct. It's constructed at the national level. There are multiple sources. This involves a lot of extrapolation and smoothing, and these are often released in revised versions. Okay, so it's not like when you're measuring labor force participation. You go to someone's house, you say, "Are you working? Yes or no?" The end. Or have you looked for a job? That's it, right? So this is like this is quite an error-prone thing which we are making up. It might be worth drilling down more into where do these numbers come from, right? How do we know about how these state-level numbers are made up? I think the worry here that I have as a micro person is that basically we're reverse engineering the smoothing and extrapolation process at the statistics office, right? That's going to generate error components that are correlated across states and are probably serially correlated. So at the very least, I think it would be cool to do a robustness check by using different vintages of the output data. And if the results hold up, then that's good. And if the results look very different, then we feel concerned. Finally, let me just say something about what we know from the micro literature. Then it has to do with the stuff about non-tradables. We know, like for a fact, CCTs are super well studied. We know for a fact what happens when you give poor people money. Well, they buy more and better food, more protein, eggs, things like that, fresh vegetables, milk, etc. Okay, so they're better fed, and they buy better clothing, especially for children. We know these from Mexico, from studies in Colombia, and also from studies in Brazil and other countries. In the case of Brazil, but notice that all of these are tradables. So I don't know how to make sense of this given the results in the paper that say this is all about non-tradables. In the case of Brazil, Bolsa Familia, there's at least one study claiming that it doesn't decrease labor supply. So, I mean, why not look at wages if we're going to, at least in aggregate? And with the formal sector data, we could in fact construct those measures. I'm out of time, so let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's really nice and thoughtful comments. So I'll try to address a few of them. So you're right that we don't have a true Bartik instrument. It's like an unconventional. It's like a variation of a Bartik instrument. So we estimate these gammas whether in the more like macro Bartik literature they use like fixed shares. So this paper was changing fast, and I wasn't the person that submitted the paper, so I'm not sure if you got the latest version. But we have now we have a new section where we have an alternative, like real Bartik instrument using observable shares, which is related to the the importance of Bolsa Familia for each state relative to the national Bolsa Familia. But that's so hopefully in this new version this is clear. So basically, who cares about these numbers? So as we were talking over lunch, so Bolsa Familia over the past 3 years increased from like 0.5% of GDP to 1.8, 1.7. So this is just like this is a massive change in the program, and even if the program is not designed to generate these effects. It's not designed to generate growth. It's not designed to be counter-cyclical, but they do have these effects. And if you increase in the Bolsa Familia at 1.5% of GDP, and the multiplier truly is like 2% of GDP, then that explains most of growth in Brazil over the past 2 years. And it's also important because Bolsa Familia, it's a very, not everyone loves that program in Brazil, so you have to make the point that you need that. This would make like the program politically more feasible if you find some positive macro effects. It's easier to convince the population that you're going to increase these transfers. Yeah, about the relevant beta zero. Yeah, I think it's testing against the new hypothesis against beta zero, because GDP extract transfers. So I think you have to look at the significance against zero. So there is nothing about taxation. This is something we don't really think about that carefully yet. We have to check the availability of tax data at the state level, and but that's a good suggestion, and I'll look into it. So about it's a relative multiplier, as in common. So it's very different from the aggregate multiplier. So it could be the case that the aggregate effect of Bolsa Familia is negative. So like you increase Bolsa Familia in a particular state, I don't know, the whole country decrease GDP, but that state is doing better relative to the other states, but at the aggregate, GDP is going down. It could be the case, and we make that difference in the paper. So we don't compare our numbers with aggregate multipliers out there in the literature. So about the monetary issues, so I'm not sure if I fully understand that, but the thing here is that in the new Keynesian model, for these transfers to have the type of impact on GDP via, it's always via, it's a demand-driven effect. So if you don't have stick prices, then prices will increase, and this will not generate extra employment and output. So, but we don't even talk much about monetary policy. There is no change in monetary policy at the state level. So this is one of the advantages of this approach. So what's different between emerging and advanced countries? So this is something, it's like sort of like future research. I think the point we want to make here, so look, we're finding numbers that are bigger for emerging countries than they usually find for advanced economies. Why exactly the mechanism behind that, we don't know for sure. And this is something that it's in the research agenda. The placebo tests, yeah, I think we use 20, it's like a data. So yeah, maybe we can add the placebo tests with closer to the program. That's something we could do. About GDP measurement error, it's I think the idea of testing different vintages is good, and we have to do it. But GDP, it's I don't know, maybe it's like a fundamental thing, right? It's the way we measure aggregate output in the economy. Obviously, there are like measurement errors. So one thing that makes us comfortable with that is that we look also at labor income, and the impact is consistent. So yeah. Well, I'm not a PC person either. So it's a different source of information. It's from a national household survey. It's a questionnaire. How much do you make? How much do you make last month? So it's less prone for this type of measurement errors, and the results are very consistent. So I think we find a multiplier of 1.2 looking only at labor income. So that's sort of like roughly consistent with like a labor share of 0.5, 0.6, that it's usually the case for emerging countries. Yeah, about the CCTs, I mean, it's interesting. I wasn't aware about this evidence, the types of good that poor people spend when they receive transfers. We have like a previous, like an old version of this paper. So this paper started as just as a paper by Leo Feller, and then but in that paper, I think he looked at the household expenditure survey in Brazil, and he found the opposite, that the poor people in Brazil are more inclined to consume tradables and local services. So I don't remember exactly the numbers, but this is something we could include in the next version, and also obviously discuss with this literature because our findings are different. I think I will stop here.
All right, great. Any questions from the audience? Anyone? Yes.
Nice paper. I wanted to ask, what are the reasons why some states have higher multipliers than others? So what kind of explains that heterogeneity? And also, do you have like a theory, like I was thinking cash transfers, like from a permanent income hypothesis sort of view, and I was thinking, can you speak a bit to like whether cash transfers is more like a temporary change in income versus permanent?
Yeah, so this is something, it's very important. So the size of the multiplier depends a lot in the persistence of the transfers. So probably one of the reasons the both familiar multiplier is big is because of permanent transfer. So this was explored in the Penning's paper in 2021. So he compared stimulus one-off payments during the 2008 financial crisis versus permanent social security transfers. The temporary, the one-off transfer, the multiplier was like close to 0, and the permanent was like 1.5. So it matters a lot. So yeah, this is something, it's hard to investigate in the Bolsa Familia because the Bolsa Familia, it's, maybe you could compare, maybe some evidence of that is that the emergency aid during COVID, it was like a mix between Bolsa Familia and counter-cyclical policy. I think it was perceived by the population as a one-off increase in benefits, and the impact on the economy was very small. So this could be consistent with that, even though, we're talking about COVID, so it was a very different situation, but it would go in that direction. So about you mean why the multiplier is different in each state? You mean the exposure? So it might be, yeah, it's so I have to think a little bit about that. Might have to do with that, but might have to do with when it's I don't know, maybe like because some of this variation is like just the federal government creating new types of benefits. So they have one for child, and then they have one for teenagers, and then they generate one. They keep changing that, and that just like favors more. Maybe it's designed to save, and we have to control for that more states in the north. But I don't have I didn't investigate that particularly. Okay, guys, thanks very much.